Imagine walking into a car dealership, hoping for a simple transaction, only to be met with disrespect and discrimination. That's exactly what happened to an elderly black woman at a local dealership. After being treated poorly and even kicked out by the staff, she walked away feeling humiliated. But she wasn't about to let it slide. What followed next is a story you wouldn't believe. In a shocking twist, just 5 minutes after being shown the door, she did something that would change everything. In a matter of moments, she not only regained control, but became the new owner of the very dealership that had cast her aside. How did she do it? And what was the reaction from the people who thought they could just push her out? Stick around to see how this incredible turn of events unfolded and what happened next. You won't want to miss it. To fully understand what happened, we need to go back a few hours earlier. The woman in question, let's call her Mrs. Johnson, had been looking for a new car for weeks. After hearing about this dealership's special deals, she decided to check it out. She wasn't someone who demanded luxury, just a reliable vehicle to get her from point A to point B. But when she arrived, things quickly went south. The staff, acting dismissive and uninterested, barely gave her the time of day. When she asked about financing options, the salesman gave her a cold response, saying she'd need to have a better credit history to even consider it. Mrs. Johnson, who had worked hard her whole life, felt the sting of judgment. The situation escalated when the manager, seeing her frustration, told her she wasn't the right type of customer for their business. That's when she left, but not without a plan. As Mrs. Johnson stepped out of the dealership, her anger mixed with disbelief. How could they treat her like that? She was no stranger to hard work or rejection, but this felt different. The racial undertones were impossible to ignore, and the dismissive attitude from the staff left a bitter taste in her mouth. But instead of letting it ruin her day, she kept walking, determined to make sure this wasn't the end of her story. What most people didn't know was that Mrs. Johnson had a secret. She wasn't just an elderly woman with a modest budget. She was sharp, resourceful, and had been quietly working in the background of several businesses for years. Her financial acumen, though understated, had helped her build a portfolio of investments that most would never suspect. The car dealership she had just been turned away from. She'd been keeping an eye on it for months, aware that it was struggling and up for sale. Back in her car, Mrs. Johnson made a phone call. She wasn't going to let this dealership slide into the hands of people who didn't appreciate what it could become. She'd been silently gathering information about the dealership's financial troubles, its owners, and its flaws. She knew the right people to talk to, and one call led to another. As the minutes ticked by, she began to see how the pieces could fall into place. But the real kicker was that the man who owned the dealership was no longer interested in running it. By the time Mrs. Johnson walked back through that dealership's front door, it was 5 minutes later. And this time, she wasn't there as a customer. She was there to make a deal that no one saw coming. When Mrs. Johnson walked back in, the dealership was eerily quiet. The staff, who had just moments ago laughed behind her back, were now busy pretending to ignore her presence. The same salesman who had turned her away was now nervously adjusting his tie, his earlier smugness replaced with uncertainty. Mrs. Johnson's eyes scanned the room, her expression calm but determined. The manager, who had been the first to dismiss her, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she approached the front desk where a young assistant was typing away at her computer, oblivious to the storm brewing. Mrs. Johnson didn't say a word at first. She stood there, watching, waiting. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, the young assistant looked up, her eyes wide with confusion when she saw Mrs. Johnson still standing there. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I think it's time we had a conversation," Mrs. Johnson replied, her voice steady but full of purpose. The assistant blinked, unsure of what to do. She hesitated but then nodded, leading Mrs. Johnson to the back office. As they walked through the showroom, it was clear something was off. The air was thick with tension. The salespeople glanced nervously at each other, whispering in hushed tones. It felt like the calm before a storm. Once inside the manager's office, Mrs. Johnson sat down, her back straight, and placed a folder on the desk in front of her. "You're in financial trouble," she said, cutting straight to the point. The assistant, now visibly confused, looked back at her in disbelief. Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice unwavering. "The owner is ready to sell, but you don't seem to have the resources to keep this place afloat." Before the assistant could respond, Mrs. Johnson leaned in. "I've made arrangements. I'm here to take control." The assistant froze, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Was this a joke? Did she really just say what the assistant thought she said? But Mrs. Johnson wasn't joking. She'd already done her research, had the backing she needed, and now it was time for action. The assistant's eyes widened as she processed what was happening. Was this elderly woman really about to walk in and take over the very dealership that had just humiliated her? The tension in the room grew unbearable. Mrs. Johnson, unfazed by the stunned silence, pulled out the paperwork, the contracts, the financial records, the very deal that would put the dealership in her hands. This wasn't just a sale. This was a power play. She was about to do what no one would expect. The next few moments would decide everything. Just as Mrs. Johnson was about to slide the papers across the desk, the door swung open with a sudden crash. The manager, the very one who had dismissed her earlier, stormed into the room, his face flushed with anger. His eyes locked on Mrs. Johnson, and for a moment, it seemed like he didn't even recognize her. "What is this?" he barked, his voice sharp with authority. "Who do you think you are, coming in here demanding?" But before he could finish, Mrs. Johnson stood up, her calm demeanor never wavering. "I'm the one who's going to fix this place. You were about to lose it, and I'm here to take it off your hands, whether you like it or not." The manager's face turned pale. He had no idea how she knew about the dealership's impending collapse. What she had just said wasn't public knowledge. Only a handful of people in the company were aware of the situation. He could feel. Mr. Carter glanced at the papers, then back at her, his smile barely concealing the tension in his eyes. "You've done your homework," he said, "but I think you're missing something. You see, the deal you think you're making is, well, let's say it's already been made." For a brief moment, Mrs. Johnson felt the ground beneath her feet shift. She had been so certain, so prepared, but now doubt began to creep in. Was he bluffing? Before she could respond, the manager stepped forward, his face contorted with frustration. "What he means is, you're too late. The dealership was already sold, this morning. We've been in talks with Carter for weeks. He's the one who has all the power now." Mrs. Johnson's pulse quickened, her mind raced. Everything she'd worked for, all her plans, could it really be that she had been outmaneuvered? But then, a small flicker of recognition crossed her mind. The name Carter didn't just sound familiar. It was familiar. In that moment, it clicked. Mr. Carter wasn't a new player in this game. He was a familiar face, just masked under a new identity. She'd encountered him years ago at a business conference, where he'd tried to pull similar underhanded tactics on a different company. She'd watched him rise, clawing his way to the top using manipulation and deception. But what he hadn't realized was that Mrs. Johnson had kept track of his every move. And now, the table was turning. "You think I don't know who you really are?" she asked, her voice dripping with calm confidence. Carter's smile faltered, just for a second. "I know exactly who you are, and I know how you operate. But here's the thing, you didn't account for me." Mrs. Johnson stood, no longer the woman who had been humiliated at the dealership door, but a woman who had played this game long enough to know how to win. She wasn't just fighting for a dealership, she was fighting for her dignity. With a swift motion, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number of the current owner, the one who had been ready to walk away earlier. The owner, hearing her voice, didn't hesitate. "You're right," he said over the phone, his voice tinged with surprise. "You've got this. You've earned it." Mrs. Johnson hung up the phone, her eyes still on Mr. Carter. "The dealership, it's mine. The papers are signed. Your deal is void.